The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to continue with our previous lecture, and we started talking about the within subjects design. Now, I would like to do a short review and summary of what was it that we discussed in our previous lecture. And if you haven't had a chance to attend that lecture, or if you're watching from home, remember that that information, that first lecture, is going to be linked in the description down below so that you don't miss out on the information we have already covered. In saying that, let's talk about a little bit about the review and the topics that we have discussed previously. So one of the things that we talked about previously was the definition of the within subjects design. We also talked about the specific characteristics that come with the within subjects experimental design. We talked about manipulation, and we also talked about the aspect of controlling variables and also having that comparison and control group. So are there any questions about that previous topic? In regards to trying to observe the same participants in each group, we talked about that one of those reasons can be because we'll be able to manage that sample size. And the other things that we discussed is it gives me the opportunity as a researcher to observe changes in behavior across time over a specific amount of time. We also talked about some of the limitations though, because as you know, research designs will have their advantages, but they also come with their limitations. So one of the main limitations that we talked about previously was the lack of randomization. We spoke about that in this specific regard, randomization was not possible. So any questions about some of the limitations that we discussed previously in our past lecture? Good deal. Fantastic. Hopefully I'm not lacking in my fantastics. I'm going to start adding those hashtags in the videos. Fantastic. 3 A's and 3 N's. So remember that. 3 A's and 3 N's. Okay. Now, in keeping with fantastic stuff, we also spoke about the steps, right? How is it that we would conduct experiments, particularly with the focus of the within subject design? We talked about how we would need to obtain a sample. We would also have to create 2 or more groups in regards to that manipulation in the levels of that independent variable. As we move along to our third step, we also cover that we would offer and observe, we should observe the same participants in each group, We also spoke about our fourth factor, and something immensely interesting about that is the control, your ability to control for matters of order and time-related factors. In our previous lecture, we also talked about a 5th component, and in that specific case, we talked about the measurement of the dependent variable. I'd like to argue that that's why we're here, right? That's why we're here. We're trying to conduct that measurement of that dependent variable based on our manipulations. And one of the last steps that we're going to incur in is we're trying to use inferential statistics. We're trying to use inferential statistics as a means to compare the differences between the groups. And lastly, perhaps one of the most important steps, one of the reasons that brings us into research is that last component, and that will be making a decision. So any questions about that specific review for our previous lecture? Good deal. Fantastic. Fantastic. Now, you heard me say within that aspect, within the aspect of control, we talked about time-related factors, and we also talked about factors related to order, right? One of the factors that could impact my research will be maturation, testing effects, and participant fatigue. We did talk about how participant fatigue is immensely relevant when it comes to those factors. And why is that? But one of the examples that I mentioned previously is that imagine that you're trying to do research about, say, psychopathology in regards to personality disorders. And one of the instruments that we tend to use that's immensely validated and standardized is that of the MMPI, right? So for example, the Minnesota Multi-Basic Personality Inventory. Now, if you have seen it, you'll know that that specific instrument has close to 600 questions, right? I need you to imagine the last time you took a really long exam, multiply that by 6, right? So notice that participant fatigue is indeed a factor that could be related to the time-related factors. So any questions about that? Any questions about our previous topic with time-related factors? All right, good deal. Now, in moving on with our review, remember that we also spoke about order effects. As you know, these effects could have that specific threat or impact towards internal validity, Now, any questions about order effects? All right, fantastic. Now, previously, we did talk about matters that we can do, matters that us as researchers, we would have the responsibility to manage and control for these factors. One of the things that we talked about was counterbalancing, and we also spoke about partial counterbalancing. Now, generally, one of the things that I would like to remind you that we did cover in our last lecture is that remember that the order, right, we will assume that in order to have an unbiased order of sequence, one of the factors that we talked about is that each of these treatments equals, say for instance, or I should say, each treatment precedes and allows each treatment one time, right? So notice that that order is going to be impacted. Any other questions about the previous topics that we discussed? Good deal, good deal. One of the last things that I would like to talk about as a reminder of the matters that we discussed in our previous lecture is that of variability. We did speak in regards to variability, and specifically in this factor, something that I like to remind you is that of individual differences. I like to call this, in a very comical way, your baggage, right? What is it that you come in with when you are a participant? Think about matters that are related to you. So for example, think about race, think about the fraternity you belong to, think about your socioeconomic status. So start thinking about factors that you come in with when it comes to you being a research participant. There's this really fun example that a professor had used when I was learning about research in my very early years as an undergrad. And something that he talked about was everybody wants to study trauma, right? Everybody's interested in studying trauma. But notice that it would be unethical, if not illegal, for me as a researcher to do something in order to manipulate the trauma and the amount of trauma that you have. So notice that, for example, I want to study survivors of natural disasters, right? Well, I can't create a hurricane, can I? But the next best thing would be to recruit individuals that draw from that population in order to conduct a study about trauma, because I simply cannot recreate a tornado. I simply cannot recreate a hurricane. So notice that the next best thing would be to find individuals that do carry those specific characteristics that you are looking into as a researcher. So that should cover a summary about the aspects that we covered in our previous lecture. So any questions about that? All right, so let's start our current lecture. In keeping with our current lecture, in keeping with our current presentation, I want to guide your attention towards the screen because something that we would like to talk about today, in continuing with our previous lecture, is comparing two related samples, Arguably, one of the main intents, one of the main goals of experimentation is we're trying to understand the implication of that independent variable and that measurement of said impact towards the dependent variable. But in order for me to be able to ascertain with a certain level of certainty that that is indeed what actually occurred, I need to engage in this specific goal. And in this instance, what I am trying to do is minimize that possibility that something other than my geared manipulation of that variable is actually what caused the differences between the groups. So notice that it is part of your roles and responsibilities as an aspiring researcher. Notice that it is your responsibility to minimize said aspects, because as a researcher, you want to ensure with a certain level of certainty that it was in fact your manipulation. It was your manipulation that did impart said measurement upon your dependent variable. So any questions about that specific goal? All right. So notice that one of the aspects that we can engage in is control. Now, in regards specifically, let's focus our attention on the within subjects experimental design. Remember that one of the things that we can do is address control. Now, if I capture your attention back to the screen, notice that we have different levels of control. So let's review them a little bit more in detail. Notice that both of these levels are going to first be present in our within subjects design. So these are two potential levels of control that we can engage in our practice, in our subject of the within subjects experimental design, I should say. Notice that the first aspect that we're going to discuss is that regarding our methods. So how is it that we're going to exert this specific control? How exactly can we do this? Well, remember in our previous summary, we talked about aspects that could impact our research. So notice that I could control for the order, right? So for example, how the items are presented to a research participant. Notice that I can also control for timing. So notice, for example, the duration of said exposure to that instrument, right? So if we fall back again to the MMPI, the amount of time that could incur in fatigue later on. So notice that those are aspects that you indeed can control. Notice that if we revert back to our slides, notice that if we were to consider a specific measurement, remember that this type of control could be exerted within the experimental design, So any questions about that? Any questions? Good deal. Now, if we revert back to our presentation, notice if you look towards the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that we can also exert a level of control regarding the statistical procedures. But how exactly are we going to exert this control? How exactly? Well, we can do so by computing the test statistic. Notice that in this specific case, we can engage in set control in regards to the quasi-experimental approach and a strictly experimental approach. So we do have the ability to exert this control within both designs. So any questions about that? Any questions? Now, if we look into your presentation, and I capture your attention to the screen, Notice that we do have the ability to select two related samples. And this, let's focus our attention in regards to the within subjects design. Because remember that in this specific case, you're going to observe the same participants in each group. Notice that in this specific case, the same or matched participants, notice that we're going to introduce another term in this lecture, which is match, and we're actually going to cover that a little bit more in detail in your following slides. But notice that in regards to a related sample, we would have the same or matched participants that are observed in each group, that are indeed observed in each group. Now, you may be wondering, how exactly am I going to be able to gather and select related samples? Well, there are two ways that I would like to talk about in regards to this aspect. The first aspect is I may be interested in matching participants based on common characteristics, right? Based on common characteristics. And what does that mean in the Queen's English, right? What does that mean? Well, notice that, as I was mentioning earlier with that hypothetical example that you're trying to observe participants that have been survivors of a specific trauma. So for example, think about the example that I gave you about surviving a natural disaster, right? Becoming traumatized because of the survival of a natural disaster. Notice that I can start matching individuals that have said characteristics. For example, I can start matching and pairing individuals who have indeed, say, for example, individuals who have survived, say, a hurricane, individuals who have survived an earthquake, individuals who have survived a tornado. So notice that because of that characteristic, that would be what I will utilize in order to engage in matching. Now, another way that we could engage in selecting related samples is that of selecting the same participants, right? Selecting the same participants that will indeed be observed. Again, this is what we will call our within or also our repeated measures design, So any questions so far about selecting two related samples? Good deal, fantastic. Now, something really interesting about this specific method, if I am able to clear the slides for you, notice that in keeping with the example that I gave you, say we're interested in observing participants who have undergone trauma. Notice that in regards to the match samples design more specifically, something that I need to remind you is that here in this specific case, we would generally utilize that specific technique generally in the quasi and non-experimental approaches. And that simply just makes sense. And why is that? Well, generally, one of the things that may be a little bit more difficult in social sciences, for example, psychology, counseling, social work, is that generally the topics that we're interested in that could contribute to the field, that could contribute to science, is that a lot of the variables that we're interested in, we simply cannot manipulate. And that is generally some of the cases in social sciences. And because of that, because we don't have that direct manipulation of that independent variable, notice that we will have to rely on quasi-experimental approaches. And because of that, we will fall a little bit more commonly within the match samples design. So any questions about that? Good deal. Now you heard me speak about repeated measures design. So if I capture your attention to your screen, notice that one of the things that we will be particularly geared towards in regards to the repeated measures design is that we will be geared towards selecting and observing that same sample from a specific population across each group. Notice that one of the advantages that we could do and that we could exploit are specifically geared towards an experiment, right? Notice that for an aspect to be regarded as an experiment, there are multiple factors that we need to consider. But let's talk about these two specific factors. So in order for me to be able to refer to an experiment, one of the things that I will need to engage in is that manipulation. Remember, this is immensely important. In order for something to be a true experiment, notice that one of the things that we need to engage in is the manipulation of that independent variable. Another aspect for us to refer to, so we have the manipulation. So another aspect that we need to concern ourselves with is the control. Particularly, let's focus on that control of order effects. Any questions so far? Any questions? Good deal. Good deal. Now, it's interesting to have an illustration because it simplifies our understanding of the topics that we have discussed today. So I am truly happy that we have the opportunity to view a illustration, a representation of the topics that we have covered previously in our previous lecture and some of the topics that we have discussed today. So let's review this together. Let's review this illustration together. This illustration here that I want to cover with you is, notice that what we're trying to do is basically look at this setup. And this setup is interested and focused on the within subjects design. And as I noted earlier, if you hear this term, I want you to also focus on the synonym of repeated measures design. Notice that the key of this specific design is that the same participants are going to be observed in the same group. And how exactly does this definition relate to the present illustration? Well, let's look at it together. Notice that one of the first things that we would do as researchers is identify and find that specific population that you're interested in. So some of the populations are generally, I would find that many individuals are interested in, for example, people who have psychopathology, individuals who have mental illness, say, for example, specific populations and serving underrepresented groups. So imagine that you are serving, say, for instance, a population that you have defined as Native Americans or individuals who are underrepresented, individuals that you are focused in. Notice that it would be immensely unlikely, if not impossible or immensely costly, to be able to examine an entire population. Notice that, for instance, maybe you're interested in studying the entire population of inmates in our state. Well, is it possible? I mean, it's possible. Is it probable? Well, a lot of researchers don't have the resources to be able to examine a whole population, which is why sometimes we will revert to a sample. And if you recall from previous lectures, you'll remember that a sample, generally, if we are lucky, we're able to draw a representative sample, and that is a part of the population. Hopefully, indeed, it will be representative. So notice, you have to find that population. So I want you to think of yourself as that future researcher that has those resources, and think about that population that you're interested in. Now, I want to take you on this journey and start thinking about, okay, this is the population that I am interested in. How am I going to draw that sample? And again, sample is that part of the population, hopefully that's representative. But remember, this specific illustration is geared towards the within subjects design. Notice that in this specific case, remember that the same participants, right, are going to be observed in each group. Notice that in this specific case, we had group number 1 and group number 2. And again, we will have the same participants. So notice that the same participants are going to fall within those groups. Notice that one of your important roles as that future researcher, remember that it is that manipulation of the levels of this specific independent variable. So in moving across our illustration, notice that within this role, you become the manipulator of that independent variable. So hopefully this is a really good illustration. This is a really good illustration to help you see the specific drawings, the specific aspects that would be involved, particularly in this specific illustration within and in regards to the within subjects design. So any questions about that? Good deal. Fantastic. So you did hear me previously, very briefly, talk about the topic of match samples design, match samples design. And in this specific case, right, we are going to match said participants based on pre-existing shared traits. So for example, in that specific case, being enrolled in a research class, that is something you came in with. I didn't assign you to take a research class. You came in as a research participant with that specific aspect. Notice that as I mentioned earlier, generally, this aspect is very beneficial when it comes to the quasi-experimental approach. But notice, as a little caveat, remember that generally it cannot be used. We cannot use this specific method in regards to an experimental design. Notice that perhaps the most important aspect of the match samples design is that those groups are going to be created based on that pre-existing characteristic, and it is not created. Those groups are not created based on any manipulation that researcher might have possibly engaged in, because I'm interested in those pre-existing characteristics. I am unable to conduct in said manipulation. So the groups will be created because of their matching, because of the pre-existing characteristics. Now, I want to give you a little bit of more detailed information when it comes to matching, because again, you will see this an awful lot in social sciences because of the fact that the topics that we study are not necessarily things we can manipulate, right? I may be interested in studying someone who has perhaps been diagnosed with a substance dependency or a substance addiction disorder, but how ethical would it be for me to say, here's some heroin, become addicted to heroin, right? So because we don't have the ability to engage in that manipulation, here, I want you to have so many milligrams of said drug, right? So that would be an immensely difficult factor. But we could, say, for example, recruit participants that are unfortunately undergoing, say, for example, a substance use concern. So because of that, we will be able to start matching participants in that specific regard. So notice that just because you're unable to conduct set manipulation, it doesn't mean that that topic does not need to be studied or it cannot be studied, right? So because we do have other alternatives, for example, a quasi-experimental approach. Now, if I revert your attention back to your screen, if we go back to your slides, notice that I want to discuss a little bit more in detail what matching entails. Notice that we are going to cover two specific types of matching. Now, notice that the first one that we're going to talk about is that occurs naturally. That type of matching of pairs that could become natural, that could come from a natural sense. Notice that what I mean by naturally occurring is, as a researcher, you're going to match said participants based on the pre-existing characteristics that are inherent to each specific individual in your research, all of the volunteers in your research. So notice here is a potential example, and I want to capture your attention with this specific sample. And that is, for instance, imagine that you, as that future researcher, you are interested in observing pairs of identical twins. Notice that in this specific case, what I am geared towards is I'm looking for those differences in scores. Notice that I am geared towards noticing the differences in those scores for each pair of identical twins. I'm trying to do a comparison in regards to the differences in scores of identical twins. So notice that you didn't assign them to be twins. That was a naturally occurring, a pre-existing characteristic that was indeed inherited by those individuals. So any questions of this first type of matching? Good deal. So let's move our attention towards the bottom of your screen and notice that we do have a second method that I would like to discuss, which is experimentally matched pairs. Now, in this specific case, notice that I am more geared towards, not necessarily in regards to that pre-existing characteristic, but rather when I am looking and I am focused on conducting this type of matching, notice that what I am going to utilize to match these participants, it is not those pre-existing characteristics. What I am looking for is I'm going to match these participants based on scores of that dependent variable. Specifically geared to a characteristic of interest. So notice that the main difference is in my naturally occurring pairs, I am interested in those pre-existing characteristics, whereas in my experimental sense, in my experimentally matched pairs, notice that what I am interested in is not the pre-existing, but rather the measurement of that dependent variable. Notice that if we look at the example provided in your slides, I want you to imagine that you are a researcher. Imagine that you are a researcher and you are interested in measuring intelligence, right? Imagine that you're interested in measuring intelligence, particularly those of children, right? So let's, in regards to our our population definition, you are geared towards children. Now, in regards to this hypothetical example, notice that you are going to match those children based on their scores. So imagine that you are indeed conducting a specific type of assessment in order for you to gather that data and find those measurements. So I actually brought an example for you guys today. And in regards to children, what are the instruments that are validated? Some of the instruments that are more standardized are those related to the Pearson publisher, particularly those of Wechsler. And Wechsler, for children, we have the WSED, which is the Wechsler's Intelligence Scale for Children. And luckily, your instructor over here, your dear Dr. Shar, has indeed administered said intelligence testing. But it has been, I have done it before when it comes to the WSED. How many of you are familiar with the WSED? So the WSED is a standardized measurement that we utilize in order to measure intelligence. So in keeping with your illustration of the example for experimentally matched pairs, I want you to imagine that you are this researcher and you're going to administer the WSED. And I'm actually going to pass it around so you guys have an opportunity to look at it. But remember, this is not for assessment purposes. It's for educational purposes. So I don't want you to look at this and be like, I wonder if I'm smart or not, right? So remember that this is simply for educational purposes. Now, the intent of the WSED has different scales and subscales, and it is administered by an examiner. Generally, it requires a graduate degree in the terms of a doctoral degree and licensure and or supervision. And what you do as the researcher, what you're going to do as the administrator, in keeping with our example in our screen, is that you're going to have that participant sitting in front of you. And when you are administering the weights in order to assess aspects, say, for example, of memory, right? Symbol recognition, word association, and reverse order. There's multiple scales to the weights, and the intent is to compare you with a group of your peers, right? So for example, in regards to, say, I wouldn't compare you if you're a person in your 30s, I wouldn't, whenever I conduct and find my scores of that dependent variable, I wouldn't pair you, say, for example, with a 5-year-old, with a 10-year-old, because the assessment would be different. In that case, we probably use the WSED instead of the weights. So you would sit the participant in front of you because I am looking for that experimentally matched pair, but I need those scores, right? I need those intelligence scores. So you sit the person in front of you, and the book has an interesting feature, and I'm actually going to show you a recording of how exactly you as the researcher would sit in front of your participant in regards to finding the measurement of that dependent variable, and as illustrated in your presentation, that of intelligence. All right, so I want you to imagine that you are that researcher and you're trying to find that measurement of that dependent variable of intelligence in order to conduct your experimentally matched pairs. So check this out. I do have a volunteer. His name is Billy. So what you do is you will sit across the research participants. And unfortunately, Bandura had Bo with the clown, but I only have Billy. So we're going to appreciate him as a research participant. So whenever you're matching, whenever you are trying to find that information, the ways actually you will sit in front of your participant and notice that it has a little notch. And you're thinking, what is that for? Because part of that is that the participant cannot see what you are reading. So notice that that bent line there, all you do is pop it down and it actually stands up on its own so that you're able to administer this test, and I should say assessment, so the participant cannot see it. So whenever you're looking for presentation of these items, of this stimuli for that research participant, let's say thanks to Billy. Billy was a fantastic research participant. So notice that in that specific regard, you will be able to find your data in order to conduct your measurement of dependent variable. I wish all research participants were as cooperative as Billy. Don't we all? Good volunteer. All right. Fantastic. So any questions as to an example of a research participant, Mr. Billy, and our measurement of that dependent variable, particularly geared towards the WSED or WSED. So let's say Billy has participated in my study. And now what I will intend to do, if I capture your attention back to your slides, notice that now that I have Billy's score as well as other children's scores, notice that I decided that I'm going to, in regards to the two highest scores, they are going to be paired. And then the next highest scores are paired, and so on. Notice that the children, including Mr. Billy, I usually use Peter, but this time I decided to go with Billy. So we're just doing Billy for today. So notice that once I paired Billy with Peter because they had the highest scores, and I move on to the next pairs, notice that in regards to these specific children, the children will then participate in said study based on those differences, based on us being able to compare that matched pair. So any questions about that? No, maybe Billy will make a return for another lecture. Maybe he'll be our next research participant. Maybe I'll bring him here. Who knows? It's always a surprise in our research class. All right, good deal. So if I capture your attention back to your slide, notice that whenever we are referring to the related samples t-test I want you to look into the paired samples t-test, right? So I do want you to focus your attention in this specific regard. Notice that in order for us to be able to continue with our lecture, we're good researchers here, so we like to define our terms. We like to define our terms. And in this specific case, let's look at the term of test statistic, test statistic. Whenever we are referring to test statistic, if we were going to look at it in terms of a definition, notice that a test statistic, I should say, is a mathematical formula. And we have discussed this previously in other lectures, but I do want to give you a short refresher. Notice that that test statistic is there to allow you, if in fact it was you that allowed for that difference, right? So in regards to that manipulation, right? Was it you that demonstrated and that made that impact in terms of your variability, in terms of those differences, or was it another factor? Was it another factor that contributed to those differences between my groups? There we go, 1 and 2. So a test statistic allows me to do this comparison between the groups with the intent of knowing if the differences that I observed were in fact because of manipulation, or were they from another source, so for example, error variance. Notice that in order for us to be successful in utilizing a test statistic, there are some aspects that we would need to cover. One of the aspects that needs to be covered is that the data that you are indeed engaged in and are utilizing is that falls within the integral or ratio scale side of things. So that would be one of the first aspects that we would need to consider. Another aspect that we would need to consider is that the variance in one population is indeed unknown, Any questions so far? Any questions? Fantastic. All right. If I capture your attention back to the screen, notice that we can break down our statistic. We can actually break it down. So notice that one of the things that we will look into for our numerator is notice that within this side, what we're looking into is those differences between the groups, the mean differences between those groups. Notice that in the denominator side of things, what we are looking into is for those differences, but not between the groups, but rather we're looking for the differences that are attributed indeed to error, right? Notice that error will be all encompassing. You're always going to have an amount of error in regards to many of the observations that you will conduct in the future. So I do want to remind you of that it is one of those elements that will be present in your career. Now, any questions about that? Any questions? Good deal. Fantastic. All right. So let's look at another illustration in order to facilitate our understanding. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to see it in regards to an illustration. Notice that this specific illustration here, what we're trying to do is basically noting the computation, right? Noting how exactly we're going to identify, how are we going to find out the difference scores between the groups. So let's look and interpret this illustration together. Let's do that together. So notice that the first thing that I want to capture your attention is towards the left of your screen first. So let's focus on this section first. Notice that in this specific case, I want you to imagine that you have different participants. We're going to bring Billy back. We like Billy, and then Peter, and we're going to have, say, Sarah, not Jordana, and then we have Jordana, right? So notice that we have all of our different participants. I also want you to notice these scores that are across, right? So the scores that are across, right? So this is how I would like you to view this specific illustration for the time being. Notice that in this specific case, we're going to have the between persons variability. I want you to also notice that we have group A and we have group B. In order to simplify this illustration, something that we're going to remember is that the same participants, right? So for example, Billy, Peter, and the rest of the gang, notice that they are going to have those observations. They're going to be present in each group. Notice that afterwards, we also have the mean scores for the groups, and we also are going to illustrate that subtraction. And how exactly am I going to find that subtraction? It's actually pretty simple. Notice that in this specific regard, I'm going to look across and we're going to subtract each pair, right? Each pair, I should say, of scores. So notice that for Billy, for his specific score, we subtracted that first illustration and the second participation or illustration, and notice that now we're going to have the difference in scores. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to do the same thing for each participant. So notice that now after that subtraction, notice that now I'm going to have my difference in scores. Notice that because in regards to the within groups variability, or I should say within groups, notice that whenever I conduct this subtraction, I have gotten rid of those specific within, or I should say, if I revert back to our previous illustration, notice that in calculating these differences, I have tried to eliminate the differences between the groups. So now what I'm going to be left with is the within groups variability. Notice that in this specific case, the scores were reduced to the one column. So notice that now we're not having necessarily that variability here, but I have reduced it. So instead of two columns, I have reduced this variability to simply one column, the difference scores. And because of that, I am only left with the variability within groups. I'm only left with the variability within groups. So any questions about that? Any questions? All right, good deal. That in this specific illustration that we have here, notice that it is pretty similar to the previous illustration that we saw today, but in this specific case, we are looking at more than one group. So if you recall from our previous illustration, and I will pull that up here very shortly. If you recall from our previous illustration, I only had the two groups, right? So group one and group two. But one of the more significant aspects of this specific illustration is that now I am left with three groups, right? With three groups. Notice that in this specific case, whenever we are referring to demonstrating that setup, that is what the illustration is referring to. Notice that I am geared towards demonstrating the setup of a repeated measures design. But in this specific case, we have more than two groups. So let's make sure that we have that distinction. Notice that in order for this aspect to work, one of the things that I would like to look into is that in order for us to do and engage in this specific procedure, remember that we must be utilizing the repeated measures design. Another significant component is that in this specific regard, we are unable to utilize matched samples. We're unable to use matched samples. So any questions about that? Good deal. So let's look at your illustration. So it is very similar to the one that we saw previously. So imagine again that population that you are interested in, right, as a future researcher. Notice that from this population, you are again to draw a sample from this population. Notice that just like in our previous illustration, you are also observing the same participants. You are indeed observing the same participants in each group. So notice that you are indeed observing the same individuals. Again, your responsibility as a researcher is to be able to manipulate said levels of that independent variable and ensure aspects of control as well, if we are referring to an experiment. Any questions so far? Good deal. Notice that we have covered topics that are similar to that before, but in this case, let's talk about an ANOVA. As most of you know, an ANOVA stands for an analysis of variance. So whenever you see this term, I want you to think about variance. Notice that in this specific case, we're only going to be geared towards a one way within subjects, okay? So this is the type of procedure that we're going to be utilizing today. Notice that in regards to this specific test statistic, we are only going to be able to utilize this test statistic on an interval or ratio sense. So we are only able to use this statistic, just like in our previous case. Notice that we're only going to be able to use it in an interval and ratio side of things. Notice that in this specific sample, when we are referring to the one way within subjects ANOVA, remember that in this specific case, we are interested in observing more than two groups. So previously, whenever we were talking about our test statistic, and we revert back to our previous test statistic, notice that here we were only utilizing group 1 and group 2. Whereas for an ANOVA, with an ANOVA, we may be interested in having more than two groups. Notice that an ANOVA is going to be immensely useful. An ANOVA is going to be immensely useful to let you know if there are differences between the groups. And that's what we're going for, isn't it? We are looking to see whether or not there was a difference, right? If there was a difference. But notice that one of the downfalls of the ANOVA is, sure, it's going to tell you if there is indeed the presence, if there is in fact a difference between the groups. But the downfall is it won't tell you which one. It won't tell you which pair of groups is the one that is different. Now, how exactly can we find out? Okay, I found out there is a difference, right? I found out there is a difference, but which one? So that is when you will start conducting post hoc tests, right? That's how we find out if which one is in fact the one responsible or where in which differences are present. So notice that in this specific case, you will have a post hoc test. Notice that with a post hoc, every time you see this term, I want you to think about as a synonym for after the fact, right? So after the fact. So after the fact that we have found a difference between the groups, now you're going to move into a post hoc test. The post hoc test is the one that indeed will tell you which pair was the one that we will find a difference in. Notice that very similar to our previous case, right? We will have variability between the groups in our numerator, and in our denominator, we're going to have that variability attributed to error. This is very similar to our previous instance for a test statistic. So again, we are fine with the mean differences between the group. And for this test statistic, we are looking at aspects attributed to error in our denominator. And so is the case here. Again, we have that variability between the groups, and in the denominator, we have differences attributed to error. So any questions so far about the ANOVA specifically, or any other subjects? All right, fantastic. As to how exactly are we going to find these specific numbers? Notice that we can have different sources of variability. Notice that we can have variability within the groups. Notice that we can have variability between the groups. And notice that we can also have variability between the persons. So we have 3 sources of variability. And remember that the variability we're looking into is the variability I did, right? That I manipulated into occurring with my dependent variable. Notice, if we continue on with our illustration, notice that we have the within groups, which is simply the variability of scores, right? The variability, I should say, of scores in these groups. So notice that we have group A, group B, and group C. Notice that that is my variability within the groups. Now, let me capture your attention to our second source of variability, and that is between groups. Notice that in this specific case, I'm looking at the group means. So for group 1, this was the group mean. For group B, this is my group mean. And for group C, this is my group mean. So notice that that is what we'll be focusing on when we're looking for variability between groups. And lastly, our third source of variability is that of between persons. Now, in order for me to understand the between persons variability, what we're trying to do, we will have to do some calculations. So what we're trying to do is calculate the average score of each person. Calculate the average score of each person, and it's going to be illustrated in the P row. So notice that, remember, we are observing the same participant, right? We're observing the same participant during the observation. So notice that Billy here, in the first group, he scored 2, and the second group, Billy scored 4, and in the third group, Billy scored 6. So in order to determine that between persons variability, notice that we will conduct the average for Billy, and that is what we would know as the between persons. And if we have Peter, same situation, his score for group A, score for group B, score for group C, and notice that we will add that to the P column, and again, that refers to the between persons variability. So, any questions about that? Good deal, good deal. So we have talked about what can we do? What can we do when we are observing 2 groups, when we are observing more than two groups? So in keeping with that line of thought, let's look at the Solomon 4 group design. Notice that in this specific case, we are combining. We are combining the one group pre-test post-test, and we're also combining the post-test only design. Notice that this is a very complex design. Notice that it's basically multiple designs in one. You have both the one group design, you have the pre and post, and then you have the post-test. So notice that we have 4 different elements, right? So it is a very complex design. Notice that perhaps the most interesting characteristic of the Solomon floor group design is that you are adding control groups. You are adding even more control groups. In this specific regard, notice that one of the intents of the Solomon floor group design is we perhaps want to use it. So we can conduct comparisons, say for example, to determine the treatment effects, right? Treatment effects of the post-test measure. We may also be interested in conducting this specific and engaging in this specific design because I want to control for possible confounds. Remember that you as a researcher will not be able to necessarily control for everything. There's always going to be variables. There's always going to be variables that will indeed affect that variance, right? That indeed will affect that variance outside of your manipulation. So notice that this design perhaps can give us the control in regards to other possible confounding variables that may be impacting my research. Well, it sounds like a plan, right? I can observe many designs at the same time. I can also control for confounding variables. So those are excellent aspects of this specific design. But there are limitations. Notice that it is immensely complex. Not only that, it will require that you at least have these 4 groups. Notice that previously we were only utilizing two groups, but here we will be comparing 4. So how does it look like? How does it look like? Well, as usual, we are going to first assign the participants randomly to one of these groups. So we're going to assign them randomly to these 4 groups. And I want to discuss a little bit on what these groups look like. So notice that we're going to engage in many comparisons. So the first comparison that we are going to engage in, we're trying to find the differences. We're trying to find the differences in the pre-test and post-test score for group A when compared to group B. So my first comparison would be group A and group B when it comes to the pre-test and post-test scores after the treatment has been imparted, right? After the treatment has been conducted. The second comparison that I'm going to engage in is I need you to focus on group A because we're only going to look at group A and later the post-test comparison when it comes to group C, right? So our second comparison is group A with group C as it involves a post-test, right? Notice that our third comparison with this specific design is I'm going to look into group B in the pre-test sense, and we're going to look in regards to group D and its post-test. And why do we need to do this? Well, because this specific comparison between group B pre-test, group D post-test allows me to see if factors related to time are the ones that are conducting or are influencing that variability. Notice that for my fourth comparison, I am going to observe group B. I'm going to be focused on group B in regards to the post-test, right? In regards to the post-test and the post-test of group D and the post-test of group D. And what it's going to help me with is determining even if without treatment, I was going to observe that changes anyway, right? So it's allowing me to see, even if I didn't do anything, would the participant have changed? And lastly, the fifth comparison that this specific technique allows me to look into is our comparison number 5. Here, what we're trying to do is we're going to compare the differences on the post-test scores for group C and group D in regards to the post-test scores of group A and group B. And why is this comparison significant? Well, because it allows you to see if there was any effect, including the measurement of that pretest, if there indeed was any effect on the post-test scores, Any questions about that? Any questions? All right, beautiful people, and that is the end of your lecture for the within subjects experimental design, and I'll see you in lab.